In the year 1519, a Spanish conquistador named Hernán Cortés stood on the shores of Mexico with just 500 men, staring across an alien landscape toward one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. The Aztec Empire stretched across vast territories, commanded millions of subjects, and controlled a capital city that rivaled any European metropolis. Yet within 2 years, this mighty civilization would lie in ruins, its emperor dead, its temples burning, and its golden treasures flowing into Spanish coffers. This is not just a story of conquest. This is the story of how audacity, cunning, and sheer ruthless determination allowed a handful of men from a relatively small European kingdom to topple a world empire that had dominated Mesoamerica for centuries. What unfolded between 1519 and 1521 defied every military principle, every logical expectation, and every reasonable prediction about how such conflicts should end. The numbers alone should have made Spanish victory impossible. Cortés commanded roughly 500 soldiers and 100 sailors when he first landed on Mexican shores. Facing him was an empire that controlled between 400 and 500 tributary states, with a total population reaching 5 to 6 million people. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan housed between 200,000 and 300,000 residents, making it larger than most European cities of the time. The disparity was not just numerical but logistical. The Spanish were operating thousands of miles from their homeland, cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and retreat routes. Yet, as we'll discover, the very factors that made the Aztec Empire mighty also contained the seeds of its destruction. The conquistadors didn't just stumble into victory through luck or superior technology. They systematically exploited every crack in the imperial foundation, turned strength into weakness, and transformed what should have been an impossible campaign into one of history's most stunning military achievements. When Cortés first gazed upon Tenochtitlan, built on an artificial island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, he and his men were genuinely awestruck. The city was a marvel of engineering and urban planning that surpassed anything they had seen in Europe. Massive causeways connected the island capital to the mainland, while an intricate system of canals served as highways for canoe traffic. Towering pyramids dominated the skyline, and the great temple complex at the city's heart rose like a mountain of carved stone toward the heavens. But Cortés was not a man easily intimidated by spectacle. Born into minor Spanish nobility, he had come to the New World seeking fortune and glory. What he found in Mexico was an opportunity that would either make him one of the wealthiest men in the world or get him killed in spectacular fashion. There was no middle ground. The political landscape that Cortés encountered was far more complex than a simple empire versus invader scenario. The Aztec Empire, ruled by the Tlatoani Moctezuma II at its peak, was a hegemonic system built on tribute, fear, and religious authority rather than direct administrative control. Hundreds of city-states across central Mexico paid tribute to Tenochtitlan, but many did so reluctantly, harboring deep resentments against their Aztec overlords. This system of tributary states created inherent instability. Local rulers maintained their positions, but were required to provide regular payments of goods, warriors, and captives for sacrifice. The Aztecs deliberately kept their subjects divided, playing rival groups against each other to prevent unified resistance. What they didn't anticipate was how this strategy could be turned against them by a sufficiently ruthless and intelligent enemy. Cortés understood this weakness almost immediately. Unlike many conquistadors who saw only gold and plunder, he recognized that the empire's political structure could be weaponized. If he could convince enough tributary states to rebel simultaneously, the numerical advantage would shift dramatically in his favor. But first, he needed to demonstrate that the Aztecs could be defeated. The key to everything lay in the city-state of Tlaxcala, located in the mountains east of the Valley of Mexico. The Tlaxcalans had maintained their independence against Aztec expansion for decades, fighting a series of ritual wars called flower wars that never resulted in complete conquest, but kept both sides in a state of perpetual conflict. These wars served Aztec purposes by providing a steady stream of captives for religious sacrifice, while allowing the empire to claim they could conquer Tlaxcala whenever they chose. But the reality was more complex. The Tlaxcalans were fierce warriors who had developed tactics specifically designed to counter Aztec military advantages. They understood Aztec weaknesses better than anyone, having fought them for generations. More importantly, they possessed something the Spanish desperately needed: legitimacy as enemies of the Aztec Empire and detailed knowledge of how to exploit Aztec military and political vulnerabilities. When Cortés first encountered Tlaxcalan forces, the initial meetings were hostile. The Tlaxcalans saw the Spanish as potential allies of their Aztec enemies and attacked accordingly. But Cortés recognized the strategic opportunity these fierce warriors represented. Through a combination of military demonstration, diplomatic negotiation, and shrewd political maneuvering, he managed to transform the Tlaxcalans from enemies into the most crucial allies of his entire campaign. The alliance that emerged between the Spanish and Tlaxcalans represents one of the most significant strategic partnerships in military history. It was not simply a matter of adding Tlaxcalan warriors to Spanish ranks. The Tlaxcalans provided intelligence about Aztec military tactics, knowledge of local geography, understanding of political relationships between different city-states, and most critically, legitimacy for what would otherwise appear to be a foreign invasion. With Tlaxcalan guides leading the way, Cortés began his march toward Tenochtitlan. But he was not simply moving an army across hostile territory. He was building a coalition, collecting allies from every tributary state that harbored resentment against Aztec rule. City after city joined the growing rebellion, seeing in the Spanish-Tlaxcalan alliance an opportunity to break free from Aztec domination. The psychological impact of these defections cannot be overstated. The Aztec Empire's power rested heavily on the perception of invincibility. When tributary states began openly allying with foreign invaders, it shattered the mystique of Aztec authority. Other subject peoples began to question whether the empire was truly as powerful as it appeared. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma II faced a crisis unlike anything in Aztec history. Reports reached him of strange, pale-skinned warriors mounted on unknown beasts, wielding weapons that thundered like lightning and scattered arrows of iron. Some of his advisors interpreted these reports through the lens of Aztec religious prophecy, suggesting the strangers might be connected to the god Quetzalcoatl, whose return had long been predicted. This religious confusion paralyzed Aztec decision-making at a crucial moment. Instead of immediately mobilizing the full military might of the empire to crush what was still a relatively small foreign force, Moctezuma hesitated. He sent ambassadors bearing gifts, hoping to determine the true nature and intentions of these mysterious invaders. This delay proved catastrophic, giving Cortés additional time to build his indigenous coalition and advance closer to the heart of the empire. But the Spanish faced their own challenges. Every mile deeper into Aztec territory took them further from any possibility of retreat. Their weapons, while psychologically impressive, were not unlimited. Gunpowder was precious and irreplaceable. Horses, though terrifying to indigenous warriors who had never seen such creatures, were vulnerable to the obsidian-edged weapons favored by Mesoamerican fighters. Most critically, the Spanish were entirely dependent on their indigenous allies for food, shelter, and intelligence. If the coalition collapsed, Cortés and his men would find themselves trapped in the heart of a hostile empire with no hope of survival. The conquistador had gambled everything on his ability to maintain and expand this unlikely alliance between European invaders and indigenous rebels. As the combined Spanish indigenous army approached the Valley of Mexico, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would determine the fate of an entire civilization. The Aztecs still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and controlled the most defensible capital city in the Americas. The Spanish coalition had momentum, indigenous knowledge, and weapons that could break traditional battle formations. What neither side fully understood was that the outcome would be determined not just by military prowess, but by factors beyond any commander's control. The march toward Tenochtitlan became a rolling demonstration of Spanish tactical brilliance and indigenous political awakening. Each tributary state that joined the rebellion brought not just warriors but crucial intelligence about Aztec military deployments, supply routes, and defensive preparations. The coalition swelled from hundreds to thousands, then tens of thousands, as word spread that the supposedly invincible empire could be challenged. Cortés understood that perception was as important as reality in this campaign. He deliberately staged dramatic displays of Spanish military technology whenever possible. The thunderous roar of cannons echoing across valleys, The sight of armored cavalry charging through indigenous formations, the precision of crossbow volleys cutting down enemy warriors at impossible distances. These demonstrations served multiple purposes beyond their immediate tactical effect. They convinced wavering allies that the Spanish possessed supernatural power while simultaneously spreading terror through Aztec intelligence networks. But the conquistador's greatest weapon was not gunpowder or steel. It was his ability to read the political landscape and exploit every fracture in the imperial system. When local rulers approached his camp seeking alliance, Cortés didn't simply accept their submission. He negotiated terms that made each new ally feel they were joining a legitimate rebellion rather than a foreign invasion. Former enemies of the Aztecs became partners in liberation, not subjects of a new master. The Aztec response revealed fundamental weaknesses in their imperial structure. Moctezuma continued to treat the crisis as a diplomatic problem rather than an existential military threat. He sent increasingly elaborate gifts to the approaching Spanish army, including golden artifacts that only reinforced European determination to reach the source of such wealth. Each gesture of attempted appeasement was interpreted by the conquistadors as evidence of weakness and by tributary states as proof that Aztec power was hollow. The emperor's religious advisors complicated matters further by insisting that proper rituals and ceremonies must be observed before taking decisive action. While Aztec priests consulted omens and performed elaborate sacrifices to determine divine will, Cortés moved his army steadily closer to the capital. The empire's greatest strength, its sophisticated religious and bureaucratic apparatus, became a liability when rapid decision-making was essential for survival. As autumn turned toward winter in 1519, the Spanish indigenous coalition finally reached the rim of the Valley of Mexico. From the mountain passes, they looked down upon one of the most extraordinary sights in the ancient world. Lake Texcoco stretched like a mirror beneath them, its surface broken by the geometric patterns of Tenochtitlan's canals and causeways. The city appeared to float upon the water like some impossible dream made manifest in stone and gold. For the indigenous allies, many of whom had never seen the Aztec capital, the sight was overwhelming. This was the heart of the empire that had dominated their peoples for generations, the source of tribute demands and military expeditions that had shaped their entire world. Yet here they stood, preparing to assault what had seemed utterly beyond challenge. For the Spanish soldiers, the view confirmed both their greatest hopes and deepest fears. The wealth they sought was clearly visible in the gleaming temples and palaces that crowned the island city. But so too was the magnitude of what they were attempting. Tenochtitlan was not just large, it was virtually impregnable. Surrounded by water, connected to the mainland by easily defended causeways, supplied by an intricate network of canals, the city had been designed to withstand any conceivable siege. Cortés faced a strategic dilemma that would have defeated most commanders. Direct assault was impossible with his limited forces. Traditional siege tactics were useless against a city built on water with multiple supply routes. Retreat would mean certain death, as his indigenous allies abandoned a cause that appeared hopeless. Yet somehow, he had to find a way to crack open the most formidable fortress in the Americas. The solution, when it came, demonstrated the conquistadors' understanding of psychological warfare and political manipulation. Rather than attacking Tenochtitlan directly, he would accept Moctezuma's invitation to enter the city as a guest. It was an audacious gamble that relied entirely on the emperor's continued belief that diplomacy could resolve the crisis. On the 8th of November, 1519, one of the most surreal encounters in human history began to unfold. The Spanish army, accompanied by thousands of indigenous allies, marched across the great causeway leading to Tenochtitlan's main entrance. Aztec nobles lined the route in elaborate ceremonial dress, while curious citizens crowded rooftops and canal banks to observe these strange visitors. Moctezuma himself emerged from the city to greet the conquistadors, carried on a golden litter and surrounded by the full pageantry of imperial power. The meeting between emperor and conquistador on that narrow stone causeway represented a collision between two entirely different worlds, one built on religious authority, tribute, and the careful balance of competing interests, the other driven by individual ambition, technological advantage, and ruthless opportunism. The Spanish were escorted into the heart of Tenochtitlan and housed in the palace complex near the Great Temple. For several days, An elaborate diplomatic dance continued as both sides tried to understand their situation. Moctezuma showed his guests the wonders of his capital, the floating gardens that fed the city, the magnificent temples dedicated to Aztec gods, the markets where goods from across Mesoamerica were traded. Cortés absorbed everything while calculating how to turn hospitality into conquest. He had achieved the impossible by placing his entire army inside the enemy capital without a battle. But he was also trapped. The causeways that had allowed entry could be destroyed, leaving the Spanish stranded on an island surrounded by millions of hostile subjects. Every day of delay increased the risk that Aztec leaders would realize the true intentions of their guests. The decisive moment came on the 14th of November, when Cortés made perhaps the boldest move in military history. During a ceremonial meeting, he suddenly seized Emperor Moctezuma and declared him a hostage of the Spanish crown. The shock was complete and devastating. In a single instant, the conquistador had decapitated the Aztec command structure and transformed himself from guest to master of the empire. The audacity of this act cannot be overstated. Fewer than 500 Spanish soldiers, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of potential enemies, had captured the ruler of one of the world's most powerful empires in his own throne room. The psychological impact paralyzed Aztec resistance, as nobles struggled to comprehend how such a thing was possible. For months, this impossible situation continued. Moctezuma, under Spanish control, continued to issue orders and maintain the facade of imperial authority while Cortés systematically dismantled Aztec power structures. Tribute continued to flow into Tenochtitlan, but now it was redirected to Spanish coffers. Religious ceremonies continued, but under the watchful eyes of conquistadors who viewed Aztec gods as demons to be destroyed. The indigenous allies who had made this conquest possible found themselves in an increasingly complex position. They had joined the Spanish to break free from Aztec domination, but the new order emerging was not the liberation they had anticipated. Some began to question whether they had simply exchanged one set of masters for another, potentially more ruthless group. Meanwhile, the capture of Moctezuma sent shockwaves throughout the Aztec Empire. Tributary states that had remained loyal began to waver as news spread that their supposedly divine emperor was now a prisoner. Some saw opportunity in the chaos and stopped sending tribute altogether. Others began reaching out to the Spanish coalition, seeking to position themselves advantageously in whatever new order might emerge. But the Spanish position, while spectacular in its boldness, remained fundamentally precarious. They were a tiny minority holding power through psychological dominance and indigenous alliances that could collapse at any moment. The real test of their conquest was yet to come, as forces beyond their control began to reshape the conflict in ways no one could have predicted. The fragile balance that had allowed Spanish control of Tenochtitlan through Moctezuma's captivity was about to shatter in the most unexpected way. While Cortés had been focused on political maneuvering and military positioning, an invisible enemy was already moving through the Aztec capital, one that would prove far more devastating than any European weapon. In the crowded neighborhoods surrounding the great temple complex, people began falling ill with symptoms unlike anything Aztec healers had ever encountered. High fevers, painful rashes, and agonizing pustules that covered victims from head to toe. This was smallpox, a disease that had plagued European populations for centuries, but was completely unknown in the Americas. The Spanish soldiers carried immunity developed over generations of exposure, but for the indigenous population, it was a death sentence written in their very blood. The epidemic spread with terrifying speed through Tenochtitlan's dense urban landscape. In a city where families lived in close quarters and daily life revolved around crowded markets and communal ceremonies, the disease found perfect conditions for transmission. Within weeks, entire neighborhoods were decimated. Bodies piled in the streets faster than survivors could remove them. The sophisticated urban infrastructure that made Tenochtitlan a marvel of engineering became a tomb for hundreds of thousands of its inhabitants. For the Spanish, watching from their palace compound, the epidemic was both horrifying and strategically advantageous. They recognized divine providence in a plague that struck down their enemies while leaving them largely untouched. Spanish chroniclers would later write with cold calculation about how God himself seemed to be fighting their battles for them. The disease accomplished what their small army never could have achieved through military action alone. But the plague's impact went far beyond simple mortality statistics. The death of so many people disrupted every aspect of Aztec society. Priests who understood the complex religious calendar died before they could pass their knowledge to successors. Craftsmen who maintained the city's elaborate infrastructure perished along with their skills. Government officials who administered the tribute system succumbed alongside the farmers and warriors they governed. Most critically, the epidemic struck down Aztec leadership at the worst possible moment. Moctezuma's brother and designated heir, Cuauhtémoc, contracted smallpox and died within months of assuming power after his brother's death in the fighting that followed. The empire found itself leaderless precisely when strong direction was most desperately needed. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical toll. Aztec religion taught that disease was a manifestation of divine displeasure. When the plague struck indigenous people while sparing their Spanish captors, it suggested to many that the old gods had either abandoned their people or were powerless against these foreign invaders. Religious certainty, the foundation of Aztec imperial authority, crumbled as rapidly as the bodies accumulated in the streets. Cortés recognized the opportunity that the epidemic created, but he also understood that his position remained precarious. The Spanish had been expelled from Tenochtitlan during the chaotic fighting that followed an ill-conceived massacre of Aztec nobles during a religious ceremony. The infamous Noche Triste, or Night of Sorrows, had seen Spanish forces fighting desperately to escape the city, as enraged citizens and warriors attacked from every direction. Many conquistadors died trying to carry too much stolen gold across the narrow causeways under indigenous assault. But rather than retreating to the coast and abandoning the campaign, Cortés regrouped in Tlaxcalan territory and began preparing for a return engagement. The epidemic had weakened Tenochtitlan's defenses, but the city remained formidable. A direct assault would still be suicidal against defenders fighting for their survival in familiar territory. The conquistador needed a strategy that would neutralize the advantages of geography and numbers that the Aztecs still possessed. The solution demonstrated the same political genius that had characterized the entire campaign. Instead of simply attacking Tenochtitlan with his existing forces, Cortés would systematically isolate the city by conquering every tributary state around the Valley of Mexico. Each victory would add warriors to his coalition, while depriving the Aztecs of potential reinforcements and supplies. The imperial capital would be strangled slowly rather than stormed directly. This strategy required months of careful campaigning, as the Spanish indigenous coalition moved from city to city around the lake system. Each conquest followed a similar pattern. Cortés would offer alliance terms to local rulers, emphasizing liberation from Aztec tribute, demands rather than submission to Spanish authority. Those who accepted were incorporated into the growing coalition. Those who refused faced the combined assault of Spanish technology and indigenous knowledge of local weaknesses. The psychological warfare was as important as the military victories. Each city that joined the rebellion sent a message to others that Aztec power was truly broken. The empire's tributary system, built on fear and religious authority, collapsed as former subjects realized their masters could no longer protect or punish them. What had been unthinkable just months earlier became inevitable as the rebellion gained momentum. By the spring of 1521, Tenochtitlan stood isolated in the center of Lake Texcoco, surrounded by former allies who had joined the Spanish coalition. The great causeways that connected the island city to the mainland were controlled by enemies. The canoe traffic that had once brought tribute and supplies from across the empire now carried warriors preparing for siege rather than merchants bearing goods for trade. Inside the city, conditions were desperate beyond description. The epidemic had killed perhaps half the population, leaving survivors to manage infrastructure designed for twice their number, with resources depleted by months of isolation. Food became increasingly scarce as the siege tightened. Clean water, always a challenge in a city built on a saltwater lake, became critically short when Spanish forces gained control of the aqueducts that brought fresh water from the mainland. Yet the defenders, led by the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, who had succeeded the plague-killed Cuauhtémoc, refused to surrender. They understood that capitulation would mean not just political defeat, but cultural annihilation. The Spanish had made clear their intention to destroy Aztec religion, tear down the great temples, and remake the city according to European patterns. For the defenders, This was not just a war for political control, but a struggle for the survival of their entire way of life. The siege that began in earnest during the summer of 1521 became one of the most brutal urban conflicts in human history. Spanish engineers, working with indigenous laborers, constructed a fleet of small boats that could navigate the shallow waters of the lake system. These vessels, equipped with cannons, systematically destroyed the canoe traffic that had allowed some supplies to reach the city. They also provided platforms for assault troops to attack different sections of the city simultaneously, preventing defenders from concentrating their forces. The fighting was house to house, canal by canal, temple by temple. Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies would advance through destroyed neighborhoods during the day, only to face counterattacks at night from defenders who knew every alley and rooftop. The massive stone temples that dominated the city's skyline became fortresses where desperate battles raged for days at a time. Artillery played a crucial role in breaking down the stone and adobe constructions that protected Aztec positions. The psychological impact of cannon fire echoing between the buildings was as important as the physical damage. For defenders already weakened by disease and starvation, the constant thunder of European weapons reinforced the sense that they were fighting against supernatural forces. But the Spanish coalition paid a heavy price for every advance. Indigenous allies died in vast numbers as they bore the brunt of close-quarters combat in unfamiliar urban terrain. Spanish casualties, while proportionally smaller, were irreplaceable so far from Europe. Cortés himself was nearly killed several times during the fighting, saved only by the quick action of indigenous bodyguards who had thrown their lot in with the conquistadors. The end, when it came, was as dramatic as everything that had preceded it. On the 13th of August, 1521, after 93 days of siege, Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to escape the city in a canoe. With their last leader in Spanish hands, Aztec resistance finally collapsed. The great temples were pulled down, the palaces looted, and the survivors marched away as slaves or scattered to remote villages where Spanish authority had not yet reached. The city that had once been called the Venice of the New World lay in ruins. Where magnificent pyramids had reached toward the sky, Spanish workers began constructing a European-style cathedral. The canals were filled in to create streets suitable for horses and wheeled vehicles. The very lake system that had made Tenochtitlan possible was gradually drained to provide agricultural land for Spanish colonists. In less than 3 years, one of the world's most sophisticated urban civilizations had been completely destroyed by a force that numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands. The Aztec Empire, which had dominated Mesoamerica for over a century, became a memory preserved only in Spanish chronicles and indigenous oral traditions that spoke of the time before the world changed forever. The fall of Tenochtitlan stands as perhaps the most extraordinary military achievement in human history. What began with 500 Spanish soldiers facing a million-strong empire ended with the complete destruction of a civilization that had dominated the Americas for generations. Yet this was never truly a story of European superiority over indigenous peoples. It was a tale of political genius, strategic alliances, and catastrophic timing that allowed a small group of audacious conquistadors to exploit every weakness in an imperial system. Cortés succeeded not because Spanish technology was overwhelmingly superior, but because he understood that empires built on tribute and fear contain the seeds of their own destruction. The Tlaxcalan alliance, the epidemic that devastated Aztec leadership, the tributary states that harbored generations of resentment, the religious confusion that paralyzed decision-making at crucial moments. These factors combined in ways that no commander could have planned, but that a brilliant opportunist could exploit to maximum advantage. The conquest of the Aztec Empire reminds us that in the grand theater of history, size and power mean nothing without unity, adaptability, and the will to survive at any cost. Sometimes, the audacity to attempt the impossible is the only strategy that can achieve it. The Spanish didn't just defeat an empire. They rewrote the rules of what conquest could look like when ambition meets opportunity in the crucible of war.